Okay. First of all, I want to acknowledge the obvious, the deep levels of pain that so many people in this room are experiencing, and the unbelievable levels of mistrust that exist between the folks here that are all advocating for the best interests of our children. Two people here that I didn't know were going to be here today from different points in my life, one of whom was a camp counselor that I had at Jewish overnight camp. I grew up in Long Beach, California, where I represent today. It's not a huge Jewish community at all. I was the only Jewish kid in my school, and I would be, stood up in school around any Christian holiday to always talk about the equivalent Jewish holiday. My teachers, who always thought that was well-intentioned opportunity for me to talk about my culture, ultimately ended up in bullying that would take place for me. And that's the experience of many Jews and many other ethnic groups in California. Well-intentioned discourse can actually have an unintended consequence as a result. And going to that Jewish camp, I felt a different level of comfort, of acceptance, and so forth. I also want to acknowledge one of my best friends is here, who is here to speak in opposition of this bill. And his sister is here, who has worked and dedicated her entire life at AROC. And I want to acknowledge the pain and the indignity with which Palestinian Americans, and certainly the Palestinians, are feeling right now. And there's nothing that we should be doing in the legislature to add to that indignity and take away from any of those things. I want to paint a different type of picture for everybody. All of the discourse that I've heard in this room today is about misunderstanding. It is about the Arab-Israeli conflict, and it is certainly about when one side is determining how the other side should feel about the issue of anti-Semitism and what is anti-Semitic and what is not. I can tell you, not as a legislator, but as a dad of 3 kids in public schools, that anti-Semitism in our schools is a problem. It's not the only problem. It's not necessarily driven by curricula. It's a problem. All 3 of my daughters deal with anti-Semitism, and it gets amplified by digital life today, and the way kids communicate with each other, and the way they amplify those things. And it's truly, truly, truly challenging. And in our community, we're alarmed by empirical data. Anti-Semitism is up. Anti-Semitic events are up 360% in the last 18 months. For a community that has such awful generational trauma, it's not something that we're easily able to let go of. What we should try to do today and on the other side of today is to listen to each other, to understand each other, to validate each other, and to try to work with each other to come up with ways by which all sides can be validated. And you start by acknowledging the trauma and the pain the other side is in. With very respect to the opposition, I must disagree. That is not how bills are made. Oftentimes get the viewpoints of stakeholders along the process, including our colleagues that are not here in this committee, and certainly on the Senate, and we value the input, people as yourself and others, and we incorporate that input in the process along the way. So we are beginning a journey together. And your input is critically important, and we will make informed decisions based on that input, try and incorporate those feelings and those views as we go along. I'd like to ask a question, though. I'll ask this question for both the authors and for the opposition. I don't see anywhere in this bill the mention of Israel or Palestine. Can you affirm to the author, can you affirm that this bill does not intend to silence nuanced, balanced discussions over controversial topics, and that this bill is only a means to draw a line between lessons that are appropriate for a classroom in a way that's not biased, so that students coming from families of all different viewpoints can feel valid? And I invite both sides to answer this question, please.
Well, thank you, Assembly Member, and I really want to thank you for your empathy and the understanding that you have for the deep pain that is in this room, and that there's a lot happening in the world, particularly in this issue, that has caused communities deep, deep pain for generations. There is nothing in this bill that would prevent the teaching around Israel and Palestine. However, what is important when teaching that topic or any other topic is that every child is made to feel welcomed, safe, affirmed, that supported during what could be very, very difficult conversations. And so if we have situations in our schools where a child is being called a murderer, that would be contrary to creating a safe and supportive environment. That would be contrary to a fair, balanced, and factual presentation of a conflict. So, as we've discussed here, it's very important for our schools to be able to discuss difficult issues, particularly in high school. I do think we need to think about age appropriateness, but I do think that our students in high school should be digging into difficult and challenging kinds of conversations, but they shouldn't be put at risk. They shouldn't be targeted. They shouldn't be told that they are bad people. They shouldn't be subject to the kinds of tropes that were described at the very beginning of this hearing, or the kinds of rhetoric that was described at the beginning of this hearing, both by our very eloquent witness, who is a student herself, but also by Assembly Member Zbur. And I'm reticent to repeat any of that rhetoric or tropes because we've heard so many of them so much of the time. There's absolutely a way to teach about conflict without leaning into anti-Semitism or any other kind of hate, and that's what this bill is looking for.
I thank the author for their words. And taking at face value, I would agree that when we read this text, it does not mention Israel or Palestine. Importantly, it would be weird if it did. Unfortunately, for those of us who care deeply about this issue, or for, like me, someone who has consistently been identified with a group of people who I have no affiliation or connection with, we've been watching a particularly interesting strategy that I think this committee needs to hear about, which is define anti-Semitism separate and apart from other forms of hate, and then change the definition of anti-Semitism to include critiques of Israel. The IHRA definition might be a term that we've heard in this committee or otherwise. I'm not sure if the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism has crossed your desk, but it does conflate criticism of Israel with Judaism, with anti-Semitism. That is a really dangerous place for us to be as a Jew, that those sorts of connections make spaces less safe for me to include, right? So what we see in this, what we fear, and the opposition fears in this text, is that this is step one of a second step, which is redefining anti-Semitism to include critiques of Israel that would ban the use of the term apartheid, for example, when examining or describing what is happening in the West Bank, because it is a critique of the Jewish ethno-state that is promised to Jewish people. That is the fear that we've seen over and over again in other places where the IHRA definition or a similar definition of anti-Semitism has come to the desk. And so we need that opposition to happen, to be named up front, to avoid those exact things, which would result in censorship at the school-wide level. So perhaps this bill could go further. if we redefined anti-Semitism specifically to include the discrimination of Jewish people solely based on their ethnicity or their religion, then perhaps the opposition would have a different opinion on this bill to be separate and apart from Israel.
I appreciate your
as we know,
response. I appreciate your response, and I can assure you of the, each and every member of the Legislative Jewish Caucus that this is their lone priority bill is extremely critical of the government of Israel, just as we are extremely critical of the federal administration, each and every one of us, and that makes us more patriotic, not less. So while I can identify with the fears that you have, I invite you to work with the authors on ways that can validate that fear and at the same time validate the very things that I'm talking about right now. The blaming of all Jews for the actions of some. The notion that Jews are loyal only to themselves and not to their country of birth or choice. The myth of the blood libel. The idea that because a complex and a truly awful, awful war is rampaging, that all Jews, despite their protestations, are complicit. That is dangerous. Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Alvarez.
Thank you. Thank you to the chair, and thank you to the authors.